Daddy?
Yes, dear?
Can you recondition my steering box for me?
Certainly. Today we're going to look at reconditioning a steering box. I've got here a steering box off a Nuffield tractor. It's the type used on the DM4 and the 460 and the 1060, and it's pretty common. But the first job will be to strip it and wash it all out. But first of all, let's have a closer look at some of the wear on it. First of all, let's have a closer look at the top bearing, which is quite prone to wear. As you can see on this one, if I work the steering arm at the bottom, there's quite a bit of vertical movement in that bearing. Then have a look at the cross shaft and the steering arm and the associated bushes. If I wiggle this one, you can just see it moving. That's wearing the cross shaft bushes. And also look at the shape of this arm. If I get another arm and clamp it alongside, you can see the difference between the two. This one's been hit at some time, and quite frequently steering boxes are damaged because the front wheel of the tractor hits something and the impact comes down the drag link and bends this arm. It might have bent the shaft inside. We won't know until we've washed it all out and had a look at the damage inside. I've now took the steering column off the steering box, and if I move in real close you might just be able to see the play in this bearing and bush here. When I get real close up and just waggle the steering arm like that, I've now removed the steering column and unbolted the clamps on the little arms inside and slid the cross shaft and steering arm out. The first job on the steering box is to replace these worn bushes in here, and I've got a couple of new bushes that I picked up when I was up Charnley's, and to replace them I've made myself some step to disc drifts. As you can see, the bushes fit over the drifts so I can knock the old ones out and the new ones in. Once I've installed the new bushes, I've got a special stepped reamer that reams both bushes in one pass so that I can make a good job of them. But first of all, we knock out the old bushes. So put that through there, and a few blows of the hammer. One old bush out. Doesn't look worn, but it was. Now I replace the others. I've now installed the new bushes, and the next job is to pass this reamer through them both. It's quite hard work and not something I look forward to, but it has to be done. It's got a 32mm hex on the back, so I can put a wrench on it and drive it in. I've now reamed out the bushes in the steering box, and the shaft is a nice snug fit in there. There's just a little tight spot in one position, but after a few months use that'll be fine. I've also located another steering arm that's straight, and my next step is where I deviate from William Morris's design. The original setup has a steel spacer collar and this rubber O-ring to seal it, and they don't work very well. You'll notice that it's quite common for them to have a weep of oil down the side. I ditched those two items and fit a crankshaft style oil seal with a lip on it and a spring on the back, and it's just a standard 1.5" by 2" by 1/4" seal. I'll give you a little close-up of that. It's just a normal seal with a lip on the back. Fit that in there. Having got rid of the spacer ring gives me another opportunity where I deviate from William Morris's plans again. I'm going to weld this arm onto the shaft, but not the usual spaghetti welding that you see on the front. I'm going to machine a groove in this shaft, I'm going to rebate the back of the arm and then weld them together. So next, the lathe. I have now put the cross shaft in the lathe, and I've lined the lathe tool up with where the steering drop arm comes on the splines. As you can see, there's quite a witness there to the accident. There's a little kink in the splines. What I'm going to do now is machine this out so I can weld it, and we'll take a look afterwards, see what it looks like. As you can see, I've now put a nice little groove in the shaft so that we can get a decent weld into it. Next I'll turn my attention to the steering drop arm and rebate the back of that out. I have now positioned the drop arm underneath the radial drill, and with the aid of this countersink tool I'm going to put a nice rebate in the back. We'll just switch her on and we'll be away. As you can see now, if I wind the tool up out of the way, we've got a nice chamfer in the back of the steering arm that will take a weld and not crack like the many that you see welded from the outside. I have now machined both the cross shaft and the drop arm and assembled them and put the pinch bolt in, and as you can see there's a nice groove there to get a weld into. I'll fill that with weld in a minute. But what we mustn't do is mark up this shaft where the bearing runs, or where the seal is going to run at the end. So what I do before I weld it is slide an old cross shaft bush into place that I've put a little saw cut into, and then just tighten the hose clip that I've put round it, and that will stop any sparks sticking to the important surfaces while I weld it. I've now welded the cross shaft to the drop arm. That will not be coming loose on the splines again. Now I've welded the cross shaft up, I can start turn my attention to the box and start reassembling it. First of all, a little bit of grease smeared in here to lubricate the seal going in, and I can fit the new seal. And if you just push that in there, in fact that's slid in by hand, but the old packing ring that went behind the drop arm makes a handy little seal installer, and we can tap that home. Then we've got the filler plug and the drain plug. My little trick here is to get a tube of Loctite and to just wet each side of the copper plug, the copper washer, like that, with a bit of Loctite, and then put it back on the plug like that, and then screw that home. And with the Loctite on each side of the washer and plug, do the filler plug the same. We've got a proper seal in there. You won't be having any weeps of oil down the side of your steering box. When I come to put the steering box back together, I will fill the steering box with oil through this aperture up here at the top before I finally fit the column. Now I've come to deal with the steering column itself, and we've got to replace this bearing at the top here. I've just removed the big internal circlip, and now I'll just hold it in the vise, get the lump hammer and a few taps on the bottom, and there's the steering column out, and the next thing to replace is this bearing here. I have now got the bearing off the top of the steering shaft. The nut's quite difficult to get off, I always find, and a little tip is put the shaft the other way up, grip the nut in the vise and get a Stilson on the shaft and undo it that way. That's how I go about it. Having got the bearing off, I'll show you this bearing because it's quite unusual. First of all, if you can see, I'll just move that in front of the camera. This side of the bearing has a square edge. That is so that when you put it in the steering column, the circlip that holds it in, it needs that square edge to butt against. If you put it in the wrong way round, or put a normal bearing in with the round edge, it'll just pop the circlip out. The second part about this bearing that's different is if you just spin the inner bit out, it comes out, and that inner part of the bearing is just a normal 25mm self-aligning insert like you find in any bearing anywhere in the world. I'll put it back together and hopefully I'll give it a rattle. You'll be able to see why the steering column was moving up and down. When you go to your bearing shop to get a new bearing, you may be offered something like this. This is just a dual row self-aligning bearing, as you can see, but it has two round edges. It'll do the job, but it won't stay in. It'll just pop the circlip straight out. The bearing you need, and I've got a box here that have come in. If you can read the lower number on there, the one starting with the 3. If you can't make that number out, I've written it down on a piece of cardboard here, and the number is 3SLJS25. Sorry, I'll repeat that, 3/SLJS25. Apparently the bearings are still made by RHP. I was told that by Will Charnley in October. I'll now put all this back together and then we'll go over to the steering box and look at reassembling it. When you come to put the steering column back together, the circlip that holds this bearing in here is available in different thicknesses. So if when you put it all back together and the job's finished and you bolt it all together and you grab hold of the steering drop arm and give it a good shove, you notice that this bearing is moving up and down. You can get a thicker circlip to hold it in place. So take it out, measure it, ring up Charnley's and see if they've got a thicker one. Also, the other end of this, when I come to seal it onto the steering box, I'm using a product called Loctite 510. It's a hydraulic sealant, but it's also an adhesive for sticking things in place. And I used it on the washers earlier to stop them weeping. And you'll see when I come to put the steering box back together, I've put a ring of it around the top aperture of the steering box, and then when I drop the collar on and bolt it down, we should never have any leaks. And hopefully after this has been done, you'll have a leak-free steering box for many years. And I don't take the level plug out to check the level periodically because that breaks the seals. I just leave it because unless you see any oil coming out, it should never need topping up. I've now come to the part where I've got to assemble the steering box, and I've got the welded cross shaft and drop arm. Put a bit of grease on it to help it go through the seal, and you need about 5 hands to hold these bits and the nut that goes on the end of the steering shaft and slide it all back in. And don't be embarrassed if you don't get it right the first time, because it's quite easy to put it in a spline out one way or the other, and then the pinch bolts won't go in these. So it can take some time and a few attempts to get this back together. So we'll take another look when I've achieved that. I've now come to the final assembly of the steering box. I've put the drop arm and cross shaft in and the associated parts inside, tightened the 2 pinch bolts up, and the last thing to do is oil steering column, but not forgetting the little core plug that goes in the back. And I'll give you a tip here. I'm holding the core plug on one of these telescopic magnet things that you can buy at tool stands, and I've just put a smear of Loctite my favourite 510 Loctite on the edge of the core plug, so I can just push that in the hole in the back. Just get a touch, see what I'm doing. I've pushed it in with the magnet. Now just get a drift. Having tapped it home, you then give it a good thump to expand it. Now I've fitted the core plug, we can put the gear oil in. I've got 1.5 litres here in a jug. Let's see how much it holds. Not quite enough. I'll just finish it off out the can. I've filled it up now with gear oil to within ½ inch of the top. I don't know whether you can see here, I've got a couple of bolts that I've cut the head off and put a little screwdriver slot in just to help me locate. So now I'll just position that there fairly high. I can take the column and I've got to screw that in there. Not easy, but not that difficult either. Just pop that in. There we go, got it. There we go, pop it over the guide studs. I've got the bolts here. Just get these studs out. Need a bigger screwdriver. When I'm finally done this, when I fit it to a tractor, before I fit the steering wheel and the dust shield here, I'll just smear some grease all over the new bearing to lubricate the bit that allows the shaft to oscillate, because the actual bearing in the centre is sealed for life. Tighten them down. There we go. Just in case any of you are wondering, if you've not spotted them, there's some G-clamps holding this steering box down to the workbench so that it doesn't start hopping about when I'm working on it. And if I get the steering wheel now and pop it on. Well, that's nice and silent. There's no rumbling from the bearing in the steering column. And if I get this here now, there's just a minimal of movement. You never get it down to zero movement, but that's 100% better than when I took it to bits. Happy tractoring, everybody.